Hey there, everyone listening. This is Andy Johnson joining you. I work at VML Y&R, and about a month ago I got to give a workshop on a tool called BackstopJS, which you should see on your screen now. It is a tool that we recently implemented for visual testing. Unfortunately, the audio and visual at that workshop did not get recorded, so I'm doing kind of this webinar format today for anyone who might be interested in either learning more about visual testing or implementing it at their work. This tool is both open source and super easy to get started with. So we'll be able to get through some of that content fairly quickly. I'll just say really quickly thank you to VML Y&R for hosting us, EchoSelect for sponsoring that workshop that I gave, Olga Vovk, my coworker, for inviting me to the meetup, and all of the Kansas City software testers who attended. That was my first workshop, and it was a great experience. And hopefully this will be a good resource for those people who attended and also people who couldn't. So the plan for this little presentation here is to talk kind of quickly about what visual testing is, why a QA department might want to implement it. And I kind of structured it by backwards, where we'll start with the result of a BackstopJS test, kind of look at the kind of information we get by running one. Then I'll talk about how you run and configure that test, and then jump back to the installation. Yep, that's all. One note that I'll make really quick is that accompanying my workshop, I also produced this Git book, which includes pretty much all of the information that I will go through today with you. I have a couple of things that I'd like to add to it, but it's pretty much in a completed form, so I'll include a link or send it to Olga to include with in the description of this video. Okay. So the first question is, what is visual testing? Why would we want to do it? The simplest way to describe visual testing, it is what it sounds like. We're comparing the way a website looks to how it's supposed to look. Why? Because the user in this day and age is king. The user experience is the sine qua non of a successful website. And to illustrate that, I have a couple of websites here that you probably recognize. On the left is, of course, Craigslist, sporting its like circa 2004 styling. On the right, MailChimp, a much more modern looking website. Which of these, I asked, I guess, I'm asking a very rhetorical question since we're doing a webinar here. But I asked the workshop that I gave on this about a month ago, which of these websites makes you want to interact with it more? You know, they're both functional. So Craigslist can get away with its kind of ugly styling because it's Craigslist. A lot of people are already familiar with it. I don't need to really spend a lot of time figuring it out. It's all kind of right there. But the one that makes me much more excited to work on its platform is MailChimp. Craigslist is inundating me with text that's all the same like size, same color, not a lot of white space. Everything is the opposite on MailChimp. I've got plenty of white space, fairly straightforward, simple color scheme that isn't like washing everything out in the same color, etc. Another thing that always just kind of drives me crazy is that like 2 places on the Craigslist site are Times New Roman, as if somebody just like didn't update that ever. So MailChimp's design is central to its ability to create this feeling of, I want to work with this platform. And so making sure that it's visually appearing how it's supposed to is important. And that's why we do visual testing. And we use a tool called BackstopJS. So let's dive into that with the result of a BackstopJS test. It looks like this, and I have the fuller version pulled up here. So I ran this test on the Atlantic website, and when I created that test, it generated this HTML report that you see. It's just saved on my local machine now. I get a little bit of information here. Backstop default it precedes the title of every result. The Atlantic is what I labeled my test. Phone is the size of the viewport, and you can see that that is in contrast to desktop here. And I can see highlighted in pink all of the differences between reference images that I generated and test images that I generated. I can click in here and start scrubbing across and see the difference. Diff will highlight those things in pink. Test will just show me kind of both my reference and my test images. And what's going on here is that what these two kind of columns of information represent are bitmaps images. So what happened when I said BackstopJS generate the reference, and I'll show you how I do that momentarily, it opened this site that I specified, the URL that I specified in what's called a headless browser, meaning it doesn't pop up on my screen. It's just kind of running underneath the surface. It took screenshots of the whole site, and then same thing with the test images, took that screenshot, and then when I said backstop test, it not only generated this test image, it also went pixel by pixel and compared that image to the reference image and highlighted in pink all of those differences. In this case, what's going on is there's like an ad happening up here, and you can see that it kind of like, I don't know if it's a different ad or it just zooms as it loads, but you can see it rendered differently, and then that pushed, like this is the main area of concern here, this different size pushed everything down, and so everything below that point fails. This is the point in the presentation where I asked people if they had questions, and I kept this slide in here just because I liked the opportunity to show you this little puppy. Also good to get a nice brain break. One note about running this on a site like the Atlantic, a news site, this content is all going to be different. The advertisement may or may not be there every day, and these images and the headlines are going to change day by day, probably hour by hour, if not more quickly than that. So, you know, this isn't actually a great candidate for visual testing. It is a great candidate for showing you a failed test, though, so that's why I ran it here. So you're probably wondering, well, how did you generate that report? Okay, I kind of already mentioned it, and there are only 3 commands that I type into my terminal to achieve a backstop test, and I'll show that to you in the context of the code itself. I'm going to dig into this a little bit more when we talk about initializing a backstop project, but suffice it to say for now, this is where I configured everything. And most of this code, which is JSON data encoded as in the JSON format, was generated for me. I'm in Visual Studio Code, and my Zish profile theme or whatever doesn't quite come through from iTerm2, so that's why there's like some weird symbols going on here. But anyway, let me show you that in action. Backstop reference is generating my reference images. This code base is also where I have my Gitbook, so there's a lot of extra markdown files over here that you can ignore. The ones we're interested in are backstop.json and then backstop_data directory. This is where, as you can probably see, my reference images and then my test images are getting stored. Engine scripts is what my headless browser, which I'm using Puppeteer. This is where some helper functions are stored. We can kind of get into that later. And then HTML report is what it sounds like. That is where that report that we were looking at gets stored in my local directory, overwritten every time I run. So it's going a little bit slowly. What I'm doing right now is you can see that there's a delay setting here that was set to 10,000. That's in milliseconds, so 10 seconds, and that's one of the reasons I did not mean to open prettier. That's one of the reasons why that went slowly, so I just changed it to 5,000 seconds. Okay, so I ran backstop reference. My reference images are now saved here. I'm going to run backstop test. Should take exactly half as long, hopefully. And I don't have to find my HTML report. It will automatically pull up in my default browser. Okay, so we got an error you can see in the output there, and similar stuff going on. You can see it just popped up automatically. I'm going to close that one. Okay, let's run this on another site that I enjoyed kind of working with, Startland News. It's also just a cool website, a local Kansas City tech and startup news website, which is fun. And I'll show you how I kind of configure this project. Okay. So, like I said, most of this JSON was generated for me. I did change this viewport from a tablet size to a desktop just to see it a little bit easier. Only two things I really need to run a backstop test, although I'll show you a couple of extra ones. Label here, which I'm going to now update to Startland News, and of course URL. If it doesn't have a URL, it won't know where to run. Delay, I think, is either automatically set at 0 seconds or 1,000 and 1,000, or sorry, milliseconds, and 1,000 milliseconds is usually sufficient. The rest of this I have not changed at all. And let's just take a look at this website real quick. So this is another news site. Again, not a great candidate. This one changes a little bit less often. But one of the reasons I chose it is because there isn't a ton happening on this site except for, like, for example, this banner is changing. And this is a good moment to point out one of the perennial problems that has existed with visual testing, excuse me, which is that the tests are really brittle. They, different browsers and different operating systems render things slightly differently, like pixel differences between pulling up a website on the same version of Chrome on a Windows machine versus a Mac, which would cause a visual test to fail, even though it is not a problem, even though that pixel is not discernible to a viewer. Another problem that made visual tests brittle are things like this, dynamic content. So if I hit the site when this headline is up versus when this headline is up, again, I'm going to get another failure even though my website is functioning and appears how I expect it to. So let's see that failure real quick. Now that I've updated everything, I can run new reference images. Again, we're not seeing this pop up or anything because it's running headless. Although there is a setting here in engine options, I could add an argument that I said that I think is something like dash dash head, or I'm not exactly sure what, but it is in the documentation. Okay, backstop test. And you might be wondering when we're going to get to this command, and I will show you once we're done with our test here. Okay, cool. Sweet. So it did show one failure where I expected it, or a couple of failures, which is perfect. So this is this dynamic latest headlines little module thing failed as we expected to. This is an interesting issue happening here where it seems to just be slightly off again. Where else did we have a failure? Okay, with these list of supporters, it looks like that rotates as well. Okay, and then the site was not quite finished rendering, it looks like, on our when we ran our reference images. So, okay, we have a few things to address here because we don't want this necessarily to fail. I'll start with the simplest one first. To address this slight, like this tiny little pixel difference here, one thing that I can configure is in a mismatch threshold here. So I guess I should say, I'm kind of assuming that you're understanding what's going on. JSON data is encoded as key value pairs. So ID is a key, its backstop or its value is backstop underscore default. Label is a key, start land news is its value. And you can kind of think of this as just like a setting, you know. I think it's fairly intuitive what's going on, and if you don't know what some of these mean, I have pulled up the, not that one. The documentation for BackstopJS is quite well done. Their README file in their repo, which is open source, meaning free to use, is quite built out. And they have a section here with all of those keys, all of those properties that you can set, and it kind of explains what they're doing. So mismatch threshold, the one that I mentioned, percentage of different pixels allowed to pass tests. So right now we're at a tenth of a percent, so I might bump this up to 0.5. I can kind of finesse it a little bit and say, like, maybe if it's at that level, this won't fail. Close this one. Another thing to do. Okay, so now that we've finessed that, let me go back to the page itself. Okay, so this is some dynamic content. It's changing, and I don't want BackstopJS to look at it. I'm like, you know, I know this is working how it's supposed to. I want BackstopJS to ignore it. So I'm going to come down here, and this kind of takes a little bit of kind of knowing, just having like a little bit of an intuitive feel for how the DOM is kind of working, because you can see there are, in our slider here, in our Rivet headline slider, we've got a bunch of nested elements. And which one of these, like you can see even up here, we've got another container. We've got an outer container, we've got a regular container, we've got the slider, which seems to contain all of the elements, and then we've got the items themselves. We want BackstopJS to ignore like the whole sliding thing, so the way that we identify it, the way that it works in development too, is we look for a class. Okay, so I'm going to try this one, and actually I haven't tried this before, so we're going to just figure it out together. What I want it to do, what I want Backstop to do is to hide everything with that selector. So selector can be a class or an ID. Classes are indicated with a period, and IDs are indicated, if I had an ID, it would be a hash, but I don't. And I'm saying hide elements with the selector. So I need new reference images. And I need new test images. We'll see how much, what problems that solved. Okay. So that didn't quite cause this rendering thing to be ignored, but you can see that our latest headline slides disappeared, and that is no longer failing. If we wanted to come down here and ignore these supporters section, close this old test, the same process would apply. I had to come down here and open up my developer tools. Yeah, you can see that it's sliding similar to the headlines section was. And again, we've got a bunch of items. I'd kind of come up here to find which container might be the one that I want. In this case, it's either going to be this probably supporters slider, although that doesn't seem to be highlighting my element. So maybe this supporters right. It's a little bit of trial and error to configure some of these things to run. And again, kind of a cooked example because a new site, maybe not a super great example. But let's say that featured stories section doesn't change very often, and I want to make sure that it appears the same. So what we have been doing is running tests on a whole site. If I want to run a test on just a section of the site, I could do that as well. So if featured stories stays more or less the same, I can come here, see if I can find what's containing this. Looks like one of these, probably this one maybe. And it's a little bit challenging. We have some kind of, this looks like this is a WordPress site, some strange custom class name here. So it is a bit challenging maybe to identify just this one. It would be kind of a trial and error. This looks generated to me, so again, you get kind of an intuition for what might be good, what might not work so well. This might be brittle. I would want to refresh the page and see if these numbers change. But the way you would do that is let's pretend that the class name on that featured story section is just featured-stories. Instead of hiding a selector, what I could do is in selectors, and if I go back to my documentation, they probably explain it better than I can. Array of selectors to capture. Defaults to document if omitted. Use viewport to capture the viewport size. See targeting elements in the next section for more info. So if I want to target only one element to, if I want to target only like a featured stories section with a featured stories class, now if I run this, it'll only capture, our imaginary featured stories section there. Okay. Moving right along. Let's see. Oh, the third command. If I return to my results here, if I like my test, what I captured, my test images, sorry, I can run backstop approve, our third command there. And what that does is it takes my test images and uses it to replace my reference images. So what was my test images become my new reference images, and those become my source of truth. If I don't run they will stay my reference images until I run backstop approve. So those are my new reference images. If I update the site or I update my configuration, I could run backstop test then without running backstop reference before it, because I already have those reference images there. And then if my new test, if I like those, if those are my source of truth, backstop approve, they become my new reference images, and so on. Okay, let's talk about a more sophisticated use case. And I didn't pull up this website, but Coding and Cocktails is a group that I'm involved in, and their website provides a much more realistic, maybe candidate for, there I am, for visual testing. That's because this stuff isn't changing terribly often. And so I can feel reasonably confident that if I run a test on it, the content and the layout should be the same. So if a visual test fails, there's probably a problem. And I cheated a little bit. I already wrote a bunch of my configuration code here so that you don't have to sit through me typing a bunch of stuff. What I did, I do need to, however, replace the label and the URL. Okay. I will maybe leave it a surprise what's going to happen here. I am going to remove this, however, and I'll explain it in a moment. Backstop reference, our old friend. I need new reference images because we're now on a new site. Don't want to be comparing coding and cocktails to Startland News. Okay, ran into a problem here. Let's see. Sorry, it shouldn't hum. You guys are going to have to listen to that if I do. Let's pull this out of here. Oh, I feel like maybe that's a problem. Let's try this again. So with JSON files, and I ran into a problem similar to this in the demo, my eye often skips over beginning and ending brackets that might be missing or commas that might be missing, but they are like of paramount importance, and so that's where my thought went when I saw that error just now, is like, I probably forgot a comma somewhere or didn't open or close a bracket correctly. Let's see, so I removed a section that was doing a certain function, and we'll see if it was just formatted incorrectly. Seems to be taking a while, so I'm not very hopeful that that was a problem. Okay, it's having a problem getting to the site, so let's, I'm gonna just, I brought this over wholesale, I'm gonna get rid of it wholesale and go back to what we had before, which is Startland News. Okay, what I want to make sure is that I can run a test successfully on this URL before I worry about getting into our sophisticated use case that I was trying to illustrate. Save it. Backstop reference. Now I'm, it's odd that this is taking so long. It almost seems like there's a problem with the headless browser accessing this site. Shit was working a month ago, but I think I changed anything. Okay, we'll just have to move on. I'm not really sure. Command reference successfully executed, but yeah, timeout errors. The only thing that I would look for in this case is do I have a selector or something that doesn't actually exist on the page anymore, but I don't have that problem. It's odd. What I was going to show you, and I'll just point it out in the documentation instead, key press selectors takes an array of selector and string values, simulates multiple sequential key press interactions. So what I was going to illustrate is that you can have your headless browser send keys, basically, to something like a form. So similar workflow here to when we were trying to hide elements. I'm going to come here and look for a unique, actually some of this does look kind of different. I don't recognize. I was going to look for MCE email. Let's see if that exists still on this page. MCE. No? Interesting. Yeah, this mat-form kind of seems like a new thing, actually. So maybe I was having a problem with some new Angular, it looks like, components happening. Anyway, you're getting to hear me talk out loud here a little bit. Probably should have checked this before I ran it, but you know, that's development, I guess, is things change. So what I was going to do is find a class that identifies, for example, this email field, and here we're going to get to use our DOM intuition that I mentioned before and try to find, you know, I want to hit the input. Wow, okay, there's a lot of nested divs going on here, and I've lost where I'm at. Let me inspect this again. Here's the input ID, mat input -0. Here's another kind of fun thing. We want to, I should have been in Chrome and not in Firefox. When I see this mat input -0, that doesn't look super unique to me. So one thing I'd be worried about right off the bat is that this ID is not, is going to identify more than one element and then confuse my headless browser. We do have some classes here, element, autofill control, nothing about email, which I would kind of look for, like input-email. So, but let's let's assume there was a straightforward one. I could say key press select. This is what worked before. Selector MCE-email key press this fake email. This isn't my email. My middle name is Susan though. So, and then it can go to the next field. Find this input with the ID MCE F name, first name, input Andy, last name Johnson. I did in the workshop also have Puppeteer, hit subscribe, but not great practice because this is a live site. Not a great example to set to send fake data to a real site. Yeah, not best practice. Not best practice. Let's see if there's anything else I want to highlight here before I kind of wrap up. You can do some fairly sophisticated interactions. The way I had Puppeteer click subscribe is here with click selector. Kind of makes sense. You can probably guess what hover selector accomplishes. It hovers over an element. So if you want to see that a certain like image pops up correctly when you hover over it, that happens. Ready event and ready selector are ones that I used fairly often. So let's say that I want to make sure that the whole page has loaded before I take a screenshot. I might like have ready selector if there's a footer on the page, for instance. Maybe I'd tell Chromie or Puppeteer, whichever headless browser I'm using, wait until the .footer class element has loaded before you take that screenshot and compare it. That's a good way of avoiding like kind of some of those issues we were running into before where we saw that the page hadn't quite finished loading, it looked like. Same with ready event, same sort of idea. URL and reference URL. You can, instead of just passing one URL and comparing different runs to itself, to that same URL, I could have given it like a stage version of my Coding and Cocktails site and run it against that. So if you want to compare like a stage to a QA environment, you can pass those two URLs to it. One thing I do want to highlight, one other problem, and I should have had this one pulled up as well before I started, but c'est la vie. Okay, here is a website that I have visited somewhat often for the Southern Enduro Tour because I mountain bike. And I want to run a test on this. Why not? I love mountain biking. Okay, that was my that's what my thought process was when I was learning BackstopJS. So let's call this mountain biking rules. And I'm going to pass it the Southern Enduro series URL. Everything else can stay the same, I believe. Yep. And let's see if this works. I guess we'll find out if our problem was specific to Coding and Cocktails or not. I found this desktop viewport size online. It doesn't look super standard to me, but every time I see it, I'm like, man, that's an ugly number. But it was listed as one of the typical ones, so you could have as many viewports here as you wanted to if you wanted to cover like iPhone X width and height, and then a Galaxy S8 width and height. You could do that. It's taking a while again, which is exciting. Okay, there we go. Yeah, that looks right, actually. There we go. Okay, I think it worked well. That's interesting that it was running into problems with just the Coding and Cocktail site. I'm not sure what would cause that issue. Although it does seem like that site has had some updates recently. Definitely something I might want to look into for using this in the future to see if it's an Angular thing. I can't imagine it is. Maybe yeah, I don't know. I'm probably going to go back and watch this video and realize that I like spelled .com incorrectly and that was the problem. Okay, yeah, so you can tell that here's what the website is supposed to look like. Here's what it looks like when it opens up in Chromie, and what we have discovered, obviously not correct, not great, nothing useful to test here. We discovered that when Chromie pulls up our website, just before it takes the screenshot, after it does all of its stuff, it slightly resizes the browser window, and when it does that, some types of like dynamically rendered content or whatever is going on with the site, it just doesn't resize appropriately, and there is an issue opened on this and a pull request to fix it. The way it fixes it, is it here? It's here. Is by basically, you can see that other people have run into the same problem, strangely oriented. What this pull request does is it basically takes a series of screenshots and stitches them all together. So for content that does not want to resize, it doesn't make the window resize, it just like takes a screenshot, scroll, take a screenshot, scroll. And there are two approvals on this pull request, and it has not moved. And I bugged them on September 17th to merge it, and they haven't yet, unfortunately. Moving right along, before I forget, if you have any experience with, do I want to go here yet? Yep, I'll just talk about it since I started to anyway. If you have any experience with continuous integration, continuous delivery with any tools like Jenkins, CircleCI, etc., you can probably see that this is a fairly easy tool to get automated. So I could kick it off on, if I on a certain schedule, or if I merge new code or whatever. basically all you have to do, and this is going to produce a perfect segue, is make sure that Node and BackstopJS are installed on whatever server your Jenkins instance is running on. So that brings us to installation. It's super straightforward. A prereq is that you do have Node installed, and I believe I have, there might be a version requirement, maybe not. Node is fairly straightforward to install. I have some instructions here. Once you have Node installed, you can use it to install BackstopJS globally, which is what that G flag is for. You might know that already. Once you have it installed, yes, you can have the bonus of integrating it with your continuous delivery. To start a new project, let's do backstop init is what you run, and it generates a, I would go into whatever directory I wanted, where I wanted to save my new, or create my new BackstopJS project, which could be, if you have a test suite that exists already, you could initialize your backstop.json and backstop data file by running backstop init within that test project, test suite that already exists, or wherever you want. And then what you get when you run backstop init is basically all of this stuff. Like I said, tablet is default, not desktop. You'll have to input a label and a URL, but pretty much all of this is done for you. If you want to get super sophisticated, I mentioned this engine scripts section before. You can kind of see on before script and on ready script is pointing to these JavaScript files that exist in this case within Puppet, because that is the that's the engine that I have specified. So like on before.js, there's not a ton to this, but I could run, I could write my own script here, or I could update this script. You know, maybe I want to inject a certain cookie or something. Oh, hello. Okay, it's fine. So yeah, so I could, BackstopJS gives you a lot of freedom with customizing it and getting sophisticated. What else did I want to mention? This was right before Hacktoberfest started, so I did mention earlier this is an open source project, which means anyone is free to use it. Again, it's on GitHub with a great README. I was kind of hoping to actually make my own contribution to the documentation here, but whenever I was like, oh, I could do that, it's like they already have it notated. It's quite extensive. One last point, I had pulled this up. Applitools is a big player in the test automation space with visual testing. In particular, their main product is a artificial intelligence powered visual testing tool. So it's very sophisticated. It is somewhat expensive. We aren't using it because it's kind of even more muscular than what our requirements are, but if you have some pretty robust visual testing requirements, maybe you have like a ton of pages and sites to manage to visually test, you know, might be an option for a company with work like that. But they're also a great resource just for learning more about visual testing. And I loved this article. It kind of goes through, it will talk about the limitations of a bitmaps based visual testing tool like BackstopJS in this article, which is fine. You know, artificial intelligence is cool. It's pretty cool. So we'll let them keep it. And also like why you might not want to, one of the illustrations I like the most is like, why won't you just have somebody look at your site to make sure it looks right? Well, this illustrates kind of like why, like spot the differences. It's kind of challenging, and it's the same for someone looking at a website like, oh yeah, this looks fine, but actually these 16 things are wrong with it. Yeah. It also takes forever. If you have to go through like Chrome, various Chrome versions on various operating systems at various viewport sizes, very quickly becomes kind of unmanageable for a human to do just manually. So anyway, I'd recommend checking this article out, checking out their Test Automation University as well. I hope that this gave you an idea of how to get started with BackstopJS. If those instructions sucked, check out their documentation. Everything you need to know is there. And then another place that I linked in my Git book where I learned a bunch of this to start with was in David Needham's webinar, which, yep, here it is, a workshop that he gave here in Kansas City this year. And he has some great resources as well on his website, so check those out. Thanks for making it through all the way if you have. Again, my name is Andy Johnson. I work for VML Y&R in the automation of quality practice, and I have my GitHub and everything linked in my LinkedIn as well if you want to reach out. So best of luck with your visual testing endeavors.